Scientific research, an academic publisher. The ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language was created by Sumerian Turks. The phonetic sound value of each and every hieroglyphic pictures expressed an intended meaning as a verb or as a noun by the creators of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic picture symbols exactly matches the same meaning as well as the first letter of the corresponding meaning of the Turkish word first syllable with the currently spoken dialects of the Turkish language. The exact intended sound as well as the meaning of the hieroglyphic picture as the nouns and verbs is individually and clearly expressed in the original hieroglyphic picture. This includes the 30 hieroglyphic pictures of well-known consonants as well as the vowel sounds of the language of the ancient Egyptians. There are no exceptions to this rule. Statistically and probabilistic certainty beyond that what is reasonable doubt proves that the Turkish language connection, the hieroglyphic pictures match two variable phonetic value and intended meaning. Each hieroglyphic picture known as the phonetic value through the Coptic language was governed by Champollion of 1836, Robinson, who was well known as an unchallenged expert in the Coptic language. The phonetic value of each and every hieroglyphic picture matches with the corresponding meaning of the Turkish word's first letter or even the entire hieroglyphic picture as a noun or as the verb matches with the Turkish dialects. This is the case for all 30 hieroglyphic pictures. No other spoken language can approach this match. So what this is saying is the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics are actually phonetically sounded to be Turkish Coptic language. Not Egyptian, but Turkish. So what does this mean for Champollion? And what does this mean for Joseph Smith's great-granduncle, John Smith, who introduced the ancient languages into the United States in the late 1700s? Well, what it means is that this Turkish language and these hieroglyphics were probably known before Champollion claimed to have discovered them. They were probably passed down in code through families of the Middle East. And why would the Turks be involved in hieroglyphics or the Sumerian? The Upper Egypt was ruled for a while, a divided Egypt during the 18th dynasty, I believe, of Hyksos. Those were known as the Shepherd Kings or Sumerian Kings, Hittites, or what my guide told me when I was in Egypt, they were Mongolian, out of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and the Hindu Valley. So what Joseph Smith was interpreting as hieroglyphics was a well-known Turkish dialect still being used today. According to this paper, more probably will be discovered later on, but this falls in line with what my guide in Egypt told me about the Mongolian Turks who ruled under the Hyksos Shepherd kingdoms and were the ones chased out of Egypt and defeated by, I believe, Ramesses III. Might be wrong about which Ramesses it was, but Ramesses III defeated the Hyksos, kicked them out of Egypt. He's the one that drove them into the desert. Well, according to the Bible, it's been inverted. Those Sumerian Turkish invaders were kicked out by the actual Egyptians, and then they adopted the Egyptian religion, but just made it their own. They became the heroes in the Bible. These Hyksos or these Hittites or these Canaanites became the heroes of the Egyptian religion. Ancient history of the Arbans, bearers of the haplotype R1b from Central Asia to Europe, 16,000 to 1,500 years before the present. This is Joseph Smith, haplotype R1b1c, I believe specifically. It's inferred because they don't have the actual DNA of Joseph Smith. They've taken it from, quote unquote, his offspring, but we know how difficult it is to verify offspring as being your actual children. And even in my family, polygamy was practiced in the 1700s and the 1800s. They were called country wives, and most white colonialists had second wives that were known as Native American brides. Ancient history in the Arbans, bearer of the haplotype R1b from Central Asia to Europe 16,000 to 1,500 years ago. This R1b is Joseph Smith's haplotype. This article aims at constructing the history of RB ancient migrations between 16,000 and 1,500 years before the present. The regions considered are South Siberia, Central Asia, in the east, where R1b haplotype arose 16,000 years ago via the North Kazakhstan, South Urals to the Russian plain. Joseph Smith haplotype came out of the Caucasus in Turkmenistan from the Balkans and entering Europe through around 4,500 along the North Africa and Mediterranean Sea, 5,500, that's North Africa, via Egypt. North to Iberia, that's Spain, those are the Habsburgs. Remember, Catherine was married to Henry, Catherine of Aragon, from the Spanish North African family of royalty. To the North African route of the rival of the Pyrenees. Pyrenees, again, interesting. Their language is completely unique in the Pyrenees. The Arbans, bearers of the R1b haplotype, along the migration route to the Middle East and South Mesopotamia, must realize that the Macs were North African, Middle Eastern heritage. Sephardic Jews apparently have established the Sumer culture. So Joseph Smith his haplotype is associated with this Sumerian culture, or we can call the Turks. These populations became known as the Bell Beakers and moved north along with the newly arisen subclades. They are evidence from the Atlantic eastward to the Balkans, Carpathian Mountains, present-day Poland, to the western border of Russia, which largely populated the Isles. We're talking about Ireland, but these were known as the Black Irish or the dark-eyed, dark-haired Irish. Unfortunately for you gingers out there and blondies, significantly part of the Isles populated almost exclusively by the Arbans, whose frequency reaches about 85 to 95% among the populations. This is because of the Spanish invasion or the Iberian invasion and the Roman invasion of the British Isles. It was the Mediterranean invasion into the British Isles. That the Sumerian Turkish culture is the R1b, as old as 16,000 years ago, and they spread out from the Turkmenistan, Caucasus. So my question is, did Joseph Smith and his family pass down their Turkish language, and is that why they were able to interpret the scrolls or the Egyptian hieroglyphs? Because what they were really interpreting, as the previous article said, they were interpreting their Turkish language done in a hieroglyphic code. It wasn't Champollion. It is my theory that the British bankers during the period after Charles I, when everybody was exiled out of Britain into the United States, that the royal families came over to the United States through the York families, and those that were left in Europe are really just the peasants, and they had no knowledge of the Turkish language, as did, quote unquote, these North African Sephardic Jews who have Turkish language is in their background. So, did this language carry through to the Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith family? It would seem to be, since their father John Smith or their great uncle introduced ancient language curriculum, including Reformed Egyptian, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hebrew, and of course Coptic, which is Reformed Egyptian, which is really, according to the article, that they're recently discovering the Egyptian hieroglyphs are simply coded Turkish language. Interesting, you gotta say. As life moves on, things just get more interesting. Aryans and those of the R1b, so this researcher is stating that the Aryans are the R1b bloodline, and the Arbans, which is also the R1b. In the first case, that name is justified since the bearers of the R1a haplotype became the legendary Aryans who arrived in Hindustan and Iranian plateau around 3500 BC. In other words, these Aryans belong to the R1A haplotype, hence the double meaning, albeit coinciding with the Aryans. The Arbans is a convenient common term in avoidance of the repetition, the bearers of the haplotype R1b. They migrated southward in part, leaving the R1b haplotype and respective haplotypes behind, over the Caucasus to Anatolia, and that's the R1A. The Arbans have apparently established a Sumer cult, several routes carrying mainly the RM269 subclade and its downstream subclades. One route is of northern route of Russia plain to the west, 4600 to 44, into Asia Minor. They went down through North Africa, Mediterranean, via ancient Egypt to the Pyrenees. Now, this is the Akhenaten Tutankhamun bloodline. R1b has been defined as their bloodline. And this is also Joseph Smith's bloodline. This represents the Akhenaten, or the sun god, or the Aten they worshipped. The sun was uniquely a Sumerian religious rite. Egyptians were Amun, or the moon cult, not Amun, but the night cult. They studied the stars and the moons. That's their gods. But the Aten cult, for some reason, worshiped the sun. Well, I guess if you live high up in the Pyrenees and high up in the Tibetan mountains, you're going to worship the sun because it comes out and actually creates agriculture. So you have two different cultures here, one depending on their location geographically. I find this so interesting. So as we go forward, they go into Africa, and then, according to the biblical story, they get chased out of northern Egypt by Ramesses, the evil pharaoh in the Bible. However, when I was in Egypt, Ramesses was considered a hero. He fought back these Hittite or Canaanite or Mongolian, is what my guide told me. They're Mongolian, which is absolutely correct. So the local Egyptian scholars know what's going on. It's just these American scholars that don't know what's going on. So they threw out the Mongolians, which are these Canaanite Sumerian culture, and then they reunited Upper and Lower Egypt, went back to the worship of Amun, or the stars and the night sky, versus the sun god of the northern Tibet plain, and you worship the sun because, as I said, it thawed the frozen earth. Anyway, this continues how the R1b also migrated into the British Isles, Ireland. Here's the M22, which is, they say the Joseph Smith line is M222. He's called an Arbans as opposed to the R1A, which is the Aryan side. But to tell you the truth, Hitler's haplotype is not R1A or R1B, which is the Aryan Arbans haplotype. Hitler actually came out of Africa. He was an E1A, E1B. Those are African. And that is what's so hilarious about this, is that Hitler had started to worship this Aryan cult and even sent his researchers into Tibet to find this Aryan culture, or you call it the Iranian culture, but they really came down from the Caucasus into Iran, and down from the Caucasus and the Turkmenistan into Turkey and into the Mediterranean. But but Hitler and some of these people that claim to be Aryans were actually, they are the E1b, or the African races, okay, the African haplotype, which I find just ironic. The other African haplotype is Napoleon. I'm trying to think who else. Anyway, these are all Jesuits. Okay. And the Jesuits try to identify with the haplotype of the Aryans, but the Jesuits are really raising up the African haplotypes into lineages that they claim to be Aryan. This racial politics is so bizarre. And it all comes down to languages, the roots of languages. This study essentially presents an example of the application of DNA genealogy for the studying of history of mankind. This was spoken by the Arbuns from 1600 to 3000 BC, and almost certainly was communicated in its dynamics non-Indo-European language. Assumptively, these languages are considered by linguists to be assorted and disconnected dead and not so dead languages, such as Proto-Turkic, Sumer, North Caucasian, and Dene Caucasian, Basque, again the Basque language, there's no known root to it, and many pre-Indo-European languages of Europe of 5000 to 3000 BC, some later. The languages of the Arbuns may have originally been one of the languages easily flowing through millennia and across Eurasia. Voila! The reason why the Smith family were so famous globally was they were the authors of these ancient languages that had heretofore been unknown to the European continent. They published their studies, and John Smith, Joseph Smith's great uncle in Dartmouth, was the one author of ancient Sumerian, ancient Coptic, ancient language introduced in the United States. These British writers and bankers came over and interviewed Joseph Smith concerning these ancient dead languages. And this goes to my theory that I'm developing right now, is that the Smith family, being Sephardic, Jewish, Turkish, were able to, came through their bloodline, preserve these ancient languages by these coded way of communicating. So the hieroglyphics, as we have seen, the Egyptian hieroglyphics are simply coded language of this Turkish pre-Indo-European language. It's almost one for one, according to the study I quoted in the beginning. A one for one ratio that equals the spoken Turkish language with the coded hieroglyphics, which once decoded becomes the Turkish language. Fascinating. So here's the Wikipedia entry for Akhenaten, my favorite pharaoh. If anyone gets the chance to go to the Cairo Museum, must go and see the Akhenaten display. It is tremendous. And Akhenaten has been the prototype for not only Moses, but for Jesus Christ, which I will show you. Famous Christ praying in the Garden of Gethsemane was replicated off a painting on an Egyptian wall of Akhenaten praying to his sun disk god. It's exact same pose. When you see it in the Cairo Museum, you're struck with how that famous painting of Christ looking upward and praying on a rock in the Garden of Gethsemane, and his face is lit up, is identical to the Akhenaten praying in his garden. Let's go on down here. Aren't these beautiful? Look at this. Beautiful, beautiful statuary, so delicate, not like the clumsy Babylonian. This early ancient sculpture is just exquisite. Okay, so here we have the hieroglyphics, what we all know and love on Book of Abraham. So here's Horus's name. And so what that author who believes that this translates one-to-one to modern Turkish dialect, basically this is code for the Turkish language, which is the shepherd. They called them the shepherd kings, the pharaohs during the 18th dynasty of Akhenaten, who was finally thrown out, and he was despised because of his demand that they worship his one sun god and not the stars and the moon, which is what the ancient Egyptians used to make sure they planted their agriculture on time because of the Nile flooding, etc. And they were reading the stars as messages from their God, telling them when to plant, giving them their blessings, giving them plenty. And then instead of drinking wine, their sacred beverage was beer. So the founding of Amarna, this city was destroyed, but this was the ancient city of Akhenaten and his priests, who were hated by the general populace. Akhenaten was certainly a close friend of Tushata, fruit, who evidently concerned with expanding power of the Hittite Empire under its powerful ruler, Supiluna. Now Ramesses also destroyed the Hittite Empire also. Successfully, the Hittite attack Mitanni and its ruler. So the pushing out of Moses may have been really referencing Ramses as his destruction of this Hittite and Sea people culture in the Palestinian Levant area. And then the Moses biblical story is really just an adjunct to it. According to the Moses myth, the Yahweh culture is like Yahweh is you can pronounce it Yahoo, which were ancient peasants that they were Bedouins and they lived in the desert. And when Ramses went in and attacked and destroyed the Hittites and the Sea people in the Levant, it is this Bedouin culture that came in and took over the devastated Levant and became the new rulers. So the Bible points to road markers of history. It's not a one-for-one history. These are markers. And you need to know how to interpret the Old Testament in order to understand this history. Take a look at this skull. This pharaohs have this very elongated skull. I looked down, I peeked down on the display of the mummies of the pharaohs, and all of their solidify or buttress their necks as they slept because they couldn't sleep on their backs with their heads being that large. So here's Akhenaten with his huge headdress. And this is the Pope's headdress too. Pope doesn't have the head. They've got those round-headed heads. But the Akhenatens had these elongated heads. Hence their large headdresses. And I saw also in the Cairo Museum the wigs, the wigs that they would don. They would shave their heads because it was so hot in Egypt. And then they'd wear wigs outdoors when they at night or when they needed to be presentable. Both the men and the women wore wigs. Well, the wigs had this huge dome to fit over the heads of some of these Egyptians. And it's plainly evident in some of the wigs that you see on display in the Cairo Museum. They don't have the pose of the Aten. See, here he is in the west, which is the lion, the Lion of Judah. There you have it. These are the ancient Israelites. This is beautiful right here. The Pope's headdress. You can see the stars on it. Akhenaten and the monotheism and Abrahamic religion. The idea that Akhenaten was a pioneer of monotheistic religion that later became Judaism has been considered by various scholars, including Sigmund Freud, who stated that Moses and monotheism by basing his arguments on the belief that the Exodus story was historical. Freud argued that Moses had been an Atenist priest who was forced to leave Egypt with his followers after Akhenaten's death. Freud argued that Akhenaten was striving to promote monotheism, something that biblical Moses was able to achieve. Following the publication of his book, the concept entered popular consciousness. There is a strong similarity between Akhenaten and the great hymn to the Aten in the biblical Psalm 104, the Psalm of the Book of Psalms, in the Greek Septuagint version of the Bible and its Latin translation, the Vulgate. Others have likened the aspects of Akhenaten's relationship to the Aten to the relation of the Christian religion between Jesus Christ and God. Particularly, the interpretations emphasize a more monotheistic interpretation of the Atenism. The famous Christian painting of Christ praying to God the night before his death at the Garden of Gethsemane or Golgotha, the skull, is copied directly off of Akhenaten's tableau where he is praying to his Aten. Akhenaten called himself the son of the soul god, thine only son that came forth from my body, again the only begotten. And that is right down Brigham Young's belief that Michael, Adam, and Christ were the only begotten of God's body, that the rest of us we are born through sin. What is sin? Sin is the moon without light. Sin is the female. If you're born of a female, you are born in a fallen state of sin. But Brigham Young's theology of the Adam God says that Adam was our God because he was the only begotten son from the body of God, and then Christ after him. It's just that these interpreters of history and of religion are so literal. And it's possibly because of the brain configuration, as I showed, that psychopaths have very little frontal lobe activity and could hardly understand what's going on in allegories and, layers of meaning. They have very little understanding. And Christ spoke in parables. He spoke to keep the truth from these very legalistic Pharisees, okay? Pharisees, the legalistic Pharisees. So Akhenaten is the Father's image on earth, and Akhenaten is king on earth. His father is king in heaven. As a high priest, prophet, king, and divine, he claimed the central position in the new religious system because he knew what his father's mind and will, and Akhenaten atoned would interpret that will for mankind in the place of the Pope. Exactly, the Pope wears Akhenaten's headdress. And here we have Akhenaten himself telling us he's the intermediator. But of course, Akhenaten, more than likely, was mentally challenged, and priests took over. That's what happens. They've done some DNA studies now on Akhenaten and his wives, and they are blood brother and sister. Tutankhamun shows indications of inbreeding disabilities, didn't live very long. And I believe inbreeding was because this was a dying race. They were inbreeding in order to continue their race. Genus, shall I say, hominid genotype. Because right now we have intermarriage between Rh negative and Rh positive, inhospitable for having children, showing a difference in blood type, really regulates or maintains the ability to have progeny or have children. And before this was understood, it was required in order to have progeny that you stay within your bloodline or your race. Or, for example, Jewish tribal people would more than likely be able to reproduce with Jews, and Caucasians with Caucasians because of this blood incompatibility. Now the blood has through most bloodlines, have been so intermixed that this disability between different blood types have been overcome, except for the Rh negative, which they say they cannot reproduce in the laboratory. They can reproduce Rh positive AB blood, cannot produce Rh negative blood anymore. It is a dying blood type. And I believe that these Egyptians, the reason why they married brother and sister was because of the incompatibility to produce offspring from different blood types. And I believe Joseph Smith was of this blood type and was incompatible with Emma Hale, and therefore they could not produce living offspring. It's my theory that all their children were adopted, and that any DNA that they're trying to do by extrapolating from Joseph Smith's children is leading them down a rabbit hole, because there is no evidence that any of his children were his natural offspring. And I'm going to show you by their names, you can tell who produced the children. A genealogy was before today's day, contemporary day, was done by naming. How you named a person, you could trace their bloodline. Here we have all these symbols of the Book of Abraham. And little did the Book of Abraham know that they were translating it into the Turkish language. I know. I wonder what all the people of the funeral papyra they're going to have to eat their words too. If it turns out to be true that Egyptian hieroglyphs were simply coded messages for the Turkish Sumerian language. Thus, was Joseph Smith part of the house of Israel? But according to the Utah Church, he came from a Gentile nation and thus must also be considered a Gentile. Of course, wrong. His His grandfather, Solomon Mack, was born a Jew. Lydia Mack was also Jewish, making Joseph Smith through Lucy Mack and Lydia Gates 100% Jewish according to Jewish genealogy. He would not be considered a Gentile. He would be considered a born genealogical Jew if you believe that Jews or the Jewish blood is a specific racial type. It is not. Being Jewish, you can be a Syrian Jew, you can be a Jordanian Jew, you can be a Palestinian Jew, you can be a Chinese Jew. It is a religion. But if you're believing in blood types, then Joseph Smith was definitely part of the Levant Jewish bloodline. As we previously said, a Caucasus Jewish bloodline, Sumerian Jewish bloodline that migrated into Egypt and then ended up ended up with Egypt defeating the Levant, where the Canaanites and the Sumerians were. But anyway, Lehi, according to this author, let's see who this is. Joseph Smith, Irish DNA, Book of Mormon evidence. Yes, he's Irish. He's a ginger, right? Yeah. We'll take a look at how ginger-haired all of his children are. And they're all Semitic. Let's go on down here. It just seems that scholars try and dazzle you with, shall we say, cow manure. Just, throw in everything in the kitchen sink, put it in the spin cycle, and boy, an article that anyone will believe. Anyway, according to this article, Lehi equals the Manasseh, which is, according to what I was taught, I don't know if this is true, since nothing I was taught is evolving into being any kind of truth claims or any factual truth. Lehi equals Manasseh. Ishmael, which is the Mohammedan or the Islam Abrahamic religion, it comes through Ephraim, which is going to be us. So I guess we're all the Caucasian, which is correct. They did. Yeah, right through the Caucasus. And then Mulek is part of Israel of the Jews. Judah. Judah and Benjamin were the only non-scattered house of Israel that remained in the Levant after the Roman destruction. And they only remained there because they were overtaken by fake crypto Jews that worshipped Caesar, and they turned their Jewish religion into worshiping Caesar and the sun god, and Mithraism is what it is, turned into Catholicism. You can look those up, but interesting. But down here, by Michael DeGroot, I knew a DeGroot at one point, shows that Joseph Smith's genealogy turned up a surprise. According to the director of operations, a rare DNA marker shows that assumption the Smith family came from England is probably wrong. The DNA research in Joseph Smith's genealogy director says that the Smiths were Irish. A distinction without a difference. Irish were invading Britain. Britain was invading Ireland. In fact, all the Irish were kicked out of Ireland, and it was settled then by Englishmen who were very cruel, Baptist preachers types of people. Cromwell is the culprit. Most of us who immigrated before the Revolutionary War were actually kicked out by Cromwell, who kicked out all the landed gentry and aristocrats, took their names over, and became the fake crypto aristocrats. So all the quote-unquote aristocrat blue bloods in England, they're all fakes. That's why these aristocratic families, blue blood families from England, want to marry the bloodlines in America, because they know those who were pre-Revolutionary War were all the royal families. So you have Jenny Churchill more royal than her husband, Winston Churchill's father. And that's why she became so famous, is that her bloodline is more royal than the Churchills. Okay, so this is this Pareto guy. And I just want to clarify, he didn't have any of Joseph Smith's DNA. He could only take the DNA from, quote unquote, his purported offspring. We have no verification that Joseph Smith had any actual offspring except for stories, because there's no availability to test whether these offsprings were actually fathered by Joseph Smith. As we know, according to the Utah Church, there was polyandry going on like wildfire. So who knows if Emma actually had children from Joseph Smith. It's my belief they did not. They had a blood type incompatibility. And I'm going to show you when I first started having this suspicion. And it was when I pulled the census data off of Nauvoo and found that in 1842, Joseph Smith and Emma Smith had only 4 people in their household, as reported in the census. They had Joseph and Emma, and then their 2 children, Joseph Jr., Joseph the Third, not Joseph the Third, it was Joseph Jr., who was alive and well in 1842. No, he did not die a year after his birth, and Julia, their other adopted. So they only listed their 2 adopted children. After that, their household swelled, but not with born children. And it's impossible. And I'm going to show you how you can trace the names of the various children. They don't look anything alike. And it appears that the Smith household was made up of adopted children. So that's going to be my next issue. So here's out of Familypedia, Emma Hale, 1804 to 1879. And what's notable here is that some of her bloodline ancestors came from Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Israel, the Netherlands, Byzantium Empire, showing that she's from the Caucasus also. More than likely Jewish, okay? And probably presented herself as Jewish, the family. Hence, Jewish Joseph Smith, Sephardic Jewish Joseph Smith, believed that a union between Emma and he could produce offspring because there'd be no incompatibility of blood type. Unfortunately, that did not prove to be true because they had a very difficult time conceiving children. Now here are her first 2 that were adopted, Joseph Murdoch, Julia Murdoch. Now do you see how they use Murdoch as the middle name to trace the actual parentage? Okay, so we have from Emma Hale an Alvin who died at birth. He was the 3rd child. These were the 2 children that died at birth, after which they adopted their 2. And Thaddeus Smith, 1831, their 3rd child, dies immediately after birth, showing an Rh negative, Rh positive incompatibility. Then here's the Frederick Granger. Frederick Granger was born in 1836 to 1862. Well, that's highly unlikely that he was born of Joseph Smith and his wife Emma, because in the 1842 census, he does not appear in their household. But let's look at where he may have been part of the bloodline of another Mormon that was friends to Joseph Smith. So we're going to get our clues through Granger Williams as the Murdoch children who were adopted. So who was Granger Williams? Mormon. Here he is, Frederick G. Williams. More than likely the father of Joseph Smith's adopted son, Frederick Williams Smith. Frederick Granger Williams, an early leader in the Latter-day Saint movement, serving the first presidency of the church in 1833 to 1837 when he died. So he died, and more than likely Joseph Smith brought his children into his household. In 1830-1832, Williams was appointed scribe to Joseph Smith. 1837, Williams was elected Justice of the Peace in Kirtland. Although there's no record of his excommunication, Williams was rebaptized in August 1838. He was excommunicated in absentia in 1839 while Joseph was in Liberty Jail, but was restored to fellowship of the church in 1840. So he was still alive in 1840. As Smith's scribe and counselor, Williams became a close friend and confidant of the prophet and Joseph and Emma, and named one of their sons Frederick Granger Williams. So he said they liked him so much that they named their son after him, just his entire name. No, they loved him so much because they were tracing his genealogy. The lineage of Williams continues in the church today, but let's see when he died. Died 1842 in Nauvoo. That is why this Frederick Granger does not show up on the 1842 census as being part of Emma's household. So therefore, I've just put to light this theory that Frederick Williams was their natural son. He was not. So if they used any of the DNA from Frederick Williams, they would not be using the DNA of Joseph Smith and trying to figure out if he was Irish or not. A little ginger-headed Irishman. Okay, so let's take a look at another child that did not show up in Joseph Smith's census household in 1842. Let's take a look at the other children. Okay, here's another suspicious child. Alexander Hale Smith. Well, what does Hale stand for? Of course, it's one of Emma's nephews, obviously. Okay, so who could this possibly be related to? Well, Emma had a sister that died in 1837 or so, and so she could have taken over the upbringing of Alexander, who is actually born to one of her sisters. But also, what's very interesting about Alexander Hale is how he looks so much like a Native American. You put the two together, you put the famous picture of both he and Joseph Smith III together, it's night and day. One is obviously Native American, which is Alexander, out of the Mac side of the family who married Hononegah, and then the Joseph III through the Murdochs. But then we're going to have Don Carlos Smith. He only lived 1 year. Here, see, they again tried to have another child, could not produce it. And this Rh negative incompatibility sometimes can be overcome by successive children. It's usually the first 3, 4, 5, 6 children that have the worst problem. Usually the first child can be born alive, but it's always kind of the successive children that there's an incompatibility because of the antibodies that the woman forms against introduction of a different bloodline. And then here's the interesting name, Thomas Stillborn. It just says he was stillborn. That's pretty obvious. 1842 did not survive. So here's another one, David Hiram Smith. Who is this going to belong to? Of course, one of Hiram's children. That was probably born just as his Mary Fielding, married Heber C. Kimball and ran out of town with her offspring, the famous Utah Mr. Fielding Smith. Okay, but this is obviously, I believe, probably one of Hiram's children that were born. Of course, my suspicion is that Hiram was involved partially in some of this polygamous activity that was going on in Nauvoo. So this could have been one of Hiram's polygamous children. But 1844 was born the year he died. Now, of course, I'm going to have to see if Mary Fielding did have a child in 1844. We'll see. And of course, here, was Emma. This means that Emma, to have this David Hiram, would have had to be pregnant. Now, certainly my theories, I'm showing some evidence to contradict the conventional stories, the conventional narratives of Mormon history that has been completely doctored and completely miscast And even documents are invented in whole cloth. We know that Lectures on Faith, Joseph Smith, Mormon History, completely faked. Collections of diaries just stitched together and put in the voice of Joseph Smith, actual voice. If you want to continue on believing any of the documents produced by the Utah Mormon Church, you are either extremely naive or you're being paid to believe them. And that's what I believe this whole entire Mormon scholarship is all about. They're being paid. Not well, by the way. They're paid pittance to doctor and phony up history. And what they get out of it, I don't know. A pat on the back, a pat on the head, and a couple of shekels in their pocket, and off they go. And they think that this is worth it. Amazing.